an American oil tanker caught fire violently near the Strait of Hormuz after an attack. Information published by Iranian media immediately caught the attention of security observers and the global energy market. This event took place at the exact time when tensions between Iran, the US, and Israel were escalating, leading many to fear that one of the world's most strategic maritime routes may be entering a dangerous new phase. According to Iranian sources, the vessel was attacked while moving near the Hormuz area, a transit point through which approximately 20% of the global oil supply passes every day. Therefore, the incident is not merely a maritime accident or an isolated military action. In the eyes of many analysts, this could be a signal that Tehran is ready to use Hormuz as strategic leverage in its confrontation with the West. If tensions continue to escalate, any military move in this region risks triggering chain reactions in the energy market, trade, and global security. Thus, the big question being raised is whether Iran truly has the capability to turn the Strait of Hormuz into an actual battlefield, where ships linked to US interests become targets of deterrence, or if this is just a cautionary step in the increasingly fierce geopolitical struggle in the Middle East. When an oil tanker linked to the US caught fire near the Strait of Hormuz, many observers argued that this was not simply an attack at sea, but a signal that Iran had begun using Hormuz as a strategic counter-response in its confrontation with Washington. And the location of the incident makes the situation even more sensitive, because the Strait of Hormuz has long been considered the world's energy jugular. This is a narrow route connecting the Persian Gulf to the Indian Ocean, yet it holds a vital role for the global energy system. Each day, about 20% of the world's oil supply passes through this area. This figure is equivalent to tens of millions of barrels of oil, transported from major exporting nations such as Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, or the United Arab Emirates, to Asia, Europe, and many other markets. Even a small disruption is enough to make the energy market react immediately. Oil prices could skyrocket in just a few hours, shipping companies must adjust their routes, and governments monitor the situation with a high level of vigilance. Consequently, all tensions at Hormuz carry a significance that goes far beyond the scope of a maritime attack. When a ship is hit, what concerns analysts is not just physical damage or the risk of casualties, but the possibility that this area could become a flashpoint for a broader conflict. In a global economic system deeply dependent on fossil fuels, Hormuz is like a giant regulating valve. If that valve is throttled, the world's energy flow will be immediately affected. In that context, Iran's recent moves in the area have made the situation even more sensitive. Tehran's naval and paramilitary forces are believed to have increased activities in the region, from warning commercial vessels to attacks or threats targeting ships linked to US interests. Some ships have been forced to change their routes, while many others have temporarily stopped moving to wait for the situation to become clearer. In fact, despite not declaring a total blockade, these strict control measures have significantly reduced the volume of vessel traffic through Hormuz. Analysts argue that these actions are not coincidental. From a strategic perspective, Iran is using Hormuz as a tool for pressure. On one hand, Tehran wants to send a deterrent signal to the US and its allies, showing that they have the capability to directly impact the world's most important energy transport route. On the other hand, increasing control over vessels also helps Iran assert that it holds a geographical advantage that few nations possess. In the context of escalating regional tensions, the message Tehran wants to send is quite clear. If Iran is pushed into a confrontation, Western economic interests in the Middle East will also face risks. In fact, Iran's advantage at Hormuz lies not only in its geographical position. This country possesses a long coastline running along the northern part of the Strait, creating favorable conditions for the deployment of many different types of weapons. From shore-based anti-ship missile systems to small but maneuverable fast-attack boat fleets, Iran has built a maritime defense strategy characterized by deep asymmetry. Additionally, unmanned aerial vehicles, explosive-laden suicide boats, and naval mines are also tools mentioned in Tehran's operational scenarios. This strategy is based on a fairly clear logic. Iran does not need to directly confront the powerful Western fleets. Instead, they focus on creating a high-risk environment for shipping activities. Just a few small attacks, or even just the potential threat, already force shipping and maritime insurance companies to recalculate. Insurance premiums for tankers could skyrocket, alternative routes must be considered, and the cost of transporting energy increases as a result. In other words, simply by making this route unstable, Iran has been able to exert significant economic pressure on many nations. That is the essence of asymmetric warfare at sea. Instead of seeking absolute military superiority, one side uses smaller, more flexible means to disrupt the opponent's system. In the case of Hormuz, the goal is not necessarily to sink a series of tankers. Simply by making ships feel they are no longer safe when passing through the area, global trade flows have already been affected. Of course, this does not mean that Iran can easily exert total control over Hormuz. However, what is happening shows that Tehran understands the strategic value of this route very well. And in the increasingly tense confrontation with the West, Hormuz is gradually becoming a card that Iran is willing to use to protect its interests. When a ship catches fire in the middle of these narrow waters, it is not just an image of an attack, but also a reminder that one of the most important choke points of the global economy is sitting right on the edge of a larger geopolitical crisis. On the other hand, some countries are seeking to maintain direct communication channels with Tehran to ensure their vessels can pass through the area safely. A Turkish ship was recently allowed to pass through the Strait after working with the Iranian side, showing that Tehran still maintains a degree of selective control over the flow of vessels. Meanwhile, France and Italy are also reportedly seeking contact with Tehran to reach safety assurance mechanisms for their commercial ships, although these discussions are only in the preliminary stages. These diplomatic moves show that nations clearly understand that maintaining the flow through Hormuz is a vital interest. Another factor often overlooked is that Iran itself depends on this route. The majority of its oil exports must also pass through this very strait to reach international markets. This creates a strategic paradox. Iran can threaten Hormuz, even causing disruptions in the short term, but a total blockade for a long period would mean directly damaging its own crucial source of revenue. In other words, Hormuz is both a pressure card for Iran and an economic lifeline that Tehran can hardly afford to throttle with its own hands. In this context, the role of China is something that analysis cannot ignore, as Beijing has long sought to promote the use of the yuan in international trade, particularly in the energy sector. If Iran were to actually apply yuan payment conditions for a portion of oil transactions through Hormuz, this would not only help Tehran reduce its dependence on the Western-controlled financial system, but also expand China's influence in the global oil market. In other words, Hormuz could become an intersection between geopolitics and international currency competition. Of course, the most concerning scenario remains the possibility of a total blockade of the Strait. If that were to happen, the impact on the global economy would be almost immediate. Oil prices could skyrocket in a short time as supply is disrupted. In this context, the role of China is something that analysis cannot ignore, as Beijing has long sought to promote the use of the yuan in international trade, particularly in the energy sector. If Iran were to actually apply yuan payment conditions for a portion of oil transactions through Hormuz, this would not only help Tehran reduce its dependence on the Western-controlled financial system, but also expand China's influence in the global oil market. In other words, Hormuz could become an intersection between geopolitics and international currency competition. Of course, the most concerning scenario remains the possibility of a total blockade of the Strait. If that were to happen, the impact on the global economy would be almost immediate. Oil prices could skyrocket in a short time as supply is disrupted.